The rearview mirror reflected red taillights. It was 11:47 p.m. Wednesday, March 1981. Rain hammered the windshield in sheets, blurring the streetlights into watercolor smudges. He sat at the curb outside the train station, engine idling, wipers beating their steady rhythm. The radio played something low and forgettable. The heater rattled. The vinyl seat creaked when he shifted his weight. 3 people had walked past his cab in the last 10 minutes. None of them got in. They all chose other taxis. Different companies, different drivers. That wasn't unusual. People had preferences. Some wanted newer cars. Some wanted drivers who looked a certain way. Some just picked randomly, but there was something about the way they looked at his cab. Not through it, not past it, at it. A quick glance at the license plate, a momentary pause. Then they moved on. The 4th person approached differently. She walked straight to his window, tapped twice. Calm, deliberate. He rolled down the window. Rain misted his face. "You available?" she asked. Her voice was flat, professional. She wore a dark coat, collar turned up against the rain. Her hair was tucked under a scarf. She carried a small leather briefcase. "Where to?" he asked. She gave him an address, Industrial District, 20-minute drive. He unlocked the doors. She got in the back, settled into the seat without a word. He pulled away from the curb, merged into traffic. The city lights slid past, distorted by rain, and then he glanced in the rearview mirror. She wasn't looking out the window, she was looking at him, studying him. Her expression was perfectly neutral. He looked back at the road, his hands tightened on the wheel, because he'd seen that look before. 3 nights ago, different passenger, same expression, same destination. And that's when he started wondering, what if this wasn't about getting somewhere? What if this was about something else entirely? Before we dive deep into the story, subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments where you're from. This story is inspired by real Cold War espionage cases. Characters, companies, and events were fictionalized for narrative purposes. Now grab your coffee, get comfortable, at home or at work, stay alert. Another unbelievable story awaits. Let's dive deep. The ordinary world. His name was Frank Russo, 42 years old, taxi driver. He'd been driving a cab in this city for 11 years. Before that, he'd worked in construction. Before that, the Navy. 4 years on a destroyer, honorable discharge in 1968. The city was mid-sized, East Coast, industrial base, shipyards, factories, a port that handled commercial freight, rail lines cutting through the downtown, universities on the north side, working-class neighborhoods spreading out like spokes from the center. Frank lived alone in a 2-bedroom apartment above a hardware store. Divorced, 3 years. No kids. His ex-wife had moved to Florida with a man who sold insurance. Frank didn't hold it against her. The marriage had been dead long before she left. Just took them both a while to admit it. He drove a yellow cab. Not his own. He leased it from a company downtown. Paid by the week. The car was a sedan, 5 years old, with a dent in the rear quarter panel and a crack in the windshield that spread a little more each winter. The seats were patched with duct tape. The radio only picked up AM stations. The trunk smelled like cigarettes and old French fries, but the engine ran. The heater worked, the meter was accurate, and Frank knew the city like he knew the lines on his own hands. He worked nights, 5 p.m. to 3 a.m., 6 days a week. Sunday off. The night shift was different. Different passengers, different energy. During the day, you got business people, shoppers, tourists, families. At night, you got workers finishing late shifts, people leaving bars, couples going home from restaurants, and occasionally someone who didn't want to be seen getting into their own car. Frank had learned not to ask too many questions. You picked people up, you drove them where they wanted to go, you collected the fare, you moved on. That was the job. Most nights were routine. A dozen fares, maybe 15 if he was lucky. Airport runs paid well, hotel pickups were reliable. Bar closings at 2 a.m. were guaranteed business, though sometimes messy. Frank had his patterns. He started each shift at the train station, caught commuters coming in late from the city, then he'd cruise the downtown corridor, check the hotels, circle back to the restaurant district around 9, position himself near the hospital for the shift change at 11, then back to the bars for the closing rush. He knew which streets were busy, which corners were dead, which traffic lights had long cycles, which alleys made good shortcuts. which neighborhoods were safe at night and which ones weren't. He knew the regulars. Mr. Chen, who took a cab home from the laundromat every Thursday at 8 p.m. The nurse from the VA hospital who worked doubles and always fell asleep in the back seat. The college kid who called for rides when he was too drunk to walk. The businessman who kept account with the company and never tipped. Frank knew their addresses, their routines, their small talk. He knew them without really knowing them at all. And they knew him the same way. The driver, the guy with the thick forearms and the Brooklyn accent who'd moved up here after the Navy. The one who didn't talk much, but always got you there on time. It was a good job. Not glamorous, not well paid, but honest, predictable. And Frank valued predictability, which is why the anomaly bothered him. It started small. So small he almost missed it. About 3 weeks ago, he'd picked up a passenger outside a hotel downtown. Middle-aged man, dark suit, carried a briefcase. Asked to go to an address in the industrial district. Nothing unusual about that. Lots of people went to the industrial district. Offices, warehouses, shift work. But during the drive, the man didn't do what most passengers did. He didn't look at his phone, didn't read, didn't stare out the window. He watched Frank in the rearview mirror, steady, unblinking. Frank had noticed, but he didn't react. Some people were just like that, nervous, suspicious. Maybe they'd been robbed before. Maybe they didn't trust cab drivers. When they arrived, the man paid exact change, no tip, got out, walked toward a nondescript office building, disappeared inside. Frank thought nothing of it, moved on to the next fare. But 2 nights later, the same man was waiting at the same hotel, different suit. Same briefcase, same destination. Frank recognized him. Evening, Frank said. The man nodded, said nothing, got in. Same drive, same silence, same watching in the mirror, same exact change payment. Frank made a mental note. Frequent customer, fine. That happened. Then it happened again, 4 nights later. Same man, same routine. And then a week after that, it wasn't the same man. It was a woman, different face, different age, but same pattern, same hotel pickup, same industrial district destination, same silent watching, same exact change payment. Frank started paying attention. Over the next 2 weeks, he counted 7 different passengers, all picked up from the same hotel, all going to addresses in the industrial district, all exhibiting the same behavior. None of them made small talk. None of them looked at their phones. None of them seemed interested in the city passing by outside. They just watched Frank, quiet, assessing, and they all paid exact change, to the cent, like they'd calculated the fare in advance. Frank started keeping a notebook, small spiral pad he kept in the glove compartment. After each fare that fit the pattern, he'd pull over and write it down. Date, time, pickup location, destination, description of passenger, fare amount. He told himself he was being paranoid. There were logical explanations. Maybe it was a company, salespeople, consultants. They all stayed at the same hotel. They all visited the same industrial clients. They'd been told to use taxis instead of rental cars. Accounting preferred exact receipts. That made sense, except it didn't explain the watching, the silence, the way they held themselves. Tense, alert, like soldiers. Frank had been in the Navy. He knew what military bearing looked like. Posture, eye contact, economy of movement. These people had it. But they weren't in uniform. They wore business clothes, carried briefcases, looked like civilians. And yet, Frank started varying his route. Small changes, different streets, alternate turns, testing. None of the passengers reacted. None of them questioned it. None of them seemed to care which way he went, as long as he arrived at the right address. Most passengers noticed route changes. They'd ask why you were going this way instead of that way. They'd worry about the meter. They'd want to know if you were taking them the long way to pad the fare. These passengers didn't care, as long as the final destination was correct. That bothered Frank more than anything else, because it meant the destination was the only thing that mattered. Not the route, not the time, not the cost, just the destination. And you, my friend, listening right now, what would you do in that moment? Ignore it? Assume it's nothing? Or start asking questions you might not want answered? Frank chose option 3. He started watching the destinations more carefully. After dropping off these passengers, he'd circle the block, park, Wait. Observe. The buildings were nondescript. Small office complexes, warehouse conversions, light manufacturing facilities. The kind of places that did business without advertising. No flashy signs, no public-facing storefronts, just addresses and tenant lists. Frank watched as his passengers entered these buildings. Some of them stayed inside for hours, some left after 20 minutes, some never came out the front. They must have exited through rear doors. One night, Frank decided to get closer. He parked his cab 2 blocks away and walked back, stood across the street in the shadow of a loading dock, watched. The building was 4 stories, brick, windows on each floor, half of them dark. A small entrance with a security keypad. No doorman, no lobby that he could see. At 11:15 p.m., a door opened on the ground floor. A man stepped out, not one of Frank's passengers, someone else. He lit a cigarette, stood there smoking, looked up and down the street. Frank pressed himself against the wall, stayed still. The man finished his cigarette, dropped it, ground it out with his shoe, went back inside. Frank waited 10 more minutes. Nothing else happened. He walked back to his cab and drove away. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the traffic sounds from the street below. His mind kept circling back to the pattern. The passengers, the destinations, the watching. What were they doing? What were they moving? Information? Money? Something else? And why always the same hotel? Why always taxi cabs? Why not their own cars? Because taxis were anonymous. No rental agreements, no license plate records tied to specific names, just cash transactions. Nothing traceable. Frank sat up in bed. His heart was beating faster. This wasn't business travel. This was operational security. And operational security meant something worth hiding. The next night, Frank changed his routine. Instead of starting at the train station, he positioned himself outside the hotel. The same hotel where all the pickups originated. It was called the Grandview, a mid-range business hotel near the convention center. 10 stories, red brick facade, awning over the entrance. Doorman until midnight. Frank parked across the street. Killed the engine, watched. At 9:47 p.m., a taxi pulled up. Not Frank's company. A competitor. A passenger got out. Male, mid-30s. Carried a small suitcase. Walked into the hotel. At 10:02 p.m., another taxi. Different company. Female passenger. No luggage. She went inside. At 10:16 p.m., a third taxi. This one was from Frank's company. He recognized the driver, guy named Eddie. The passenger was a man in a dark coat, briefcase. He paid, got out, entered the hotel. Frank watched for 2 hours. 11 taxis total. Different companies, different drivers. All dropping passengers at the Grandview. None of the taxis picked anyone up. Only drop-offs. That was unusual. Hotels were usually balanced. People arriving, people leaving. Check-ins and check-outs. But tonight, only arrivals. Frank started his engine and drove away. His hands were cold despite the heater running. When he got home that night, he spread his notebook out on the kitchen table. Went through the entries, dates, times, descriptions. He counted 23 passengers over 3 weeks, all fitting the pattern. All picked up from the Grandview. All taken to addresses in the industrial district. But none of them picked up from the industrial district and taken back to the hotel. The trips were one way, which meant they were getting back to the hotel some other way. Different taxis, different drivers. Or maybe they weren't going back at all. Frank closed the notebook, rubbed his eyes. He was tired. He needed to sleep. He needed to stop thinking about this. But he couldn't, because something was happening. Something organized, something deliberate. And for some reason, he'd become part of it. A small gear in a machine he didn't understand. And the machine was using him. The pattern emerges. Frank decided to test a theory. If these passengers were part of something organized, they'd have protocols, schedules, predictable behaviors. So he started tracking them more systematically. He created a chart. Days of the week across the top, hours down the side. Each time he picked up one of the pattern passengers, he marked it. After 2 weeks, the chart showed clear concentrations. Tuesday nights between 10 and midnight. Thursday nights, same window. Saturday nights, slightly earlier, 9 to 11. 3 nights a week. Consistent intervals, rotating cast of passengers. Frank showed his chart to no one. He kept it folded in his notebook, hidden in the glove compartment. During his shifts, he positioned himself strategically, near the Grandview on pattern nights. Ready, and they came, like clockwork. He started recognizing some of them, not by name, they never gave names, but by face, by posture, by the way they moved. There was the tall man with grey hair, who always wore dark suits and never made eye contact. There was the woman with the severe expression who carried a leather portfolio instead of a briefcase. There was the younger man, maybe 30, with nervous hands and a habit of checking his watch every few minutes. Frank drove them all, different nights, different weeks, but always the same destinations. The industrial district, the nondescript buildings, the exact change payments. He started memorizing the addresses. There were 5 main locations, all within a 6-block radius, all commercial buildings with multiple tenants. Frank looked them up during the day when he couldn't sleep. Public records, property tax databases, business licenses. The buildings were owned by various holding companies. The tenant lists were generic, import-export firms, consulting agencies, technology services, nothing obviously suspicious, nothing illegal. But something was off. Frank couldn't articulate it, just a feeling, an instinct from his Navy days. When you're on a ship and the routine changes slightly and you can't explain why, but you know something's different. That's what this felt like. Frank started talking to other drivers, casually, during breaks at the dispatch office, over coffee at the diner where they all congregated between fares. "You ever pick people up from the Grandview?" he asked Eddie one night. Eddie shrugged. "Sure, all the time, business hotel. Good tippers usually. You notice anything weird about any of them?" "Weird how?" "I don't know, just different." Eddie looked at him. "You feeling okay, Frank?" "Yeah, just curious. They're business people, Frank. Salesmen, consultants. They all act the same. Serious, quiet, always in a hurry." Frank let it go. Eddie hadn't noticed. Maybe because Eddie didn't pay attention. Maybe because Frank was wrong. He decided to try something riskier. The next time he picked up one of the pattern passengers, the woman with the severe expression, he attempted conversation. "Visiting for business?" he asked. She looked up. Her eyes met his in the rearview mirror. "Yes. What kind of business, if you don't mind me asking?" "Consulting." "What kind of consulting?" A pause. Then, "Industrial efficiency." Frank nodded. "Lot of factories around here." "Makes sense." She didn't respond, just looked back down at her hands. Conversation over. Frank tried again 2 nights later with a different passenger. The nervous younger man. "You been to the city before?" "Several times." "For work?" "Yes." "Must keep you busy, traveling so much." "It does." Frank waited. The man said nothing else. These people weren't rude, they weren't hostile. They just didn't engage. It was like talking to walls, professional walls. Be honest, would you ignore it, or would you keep watching? Frank kept watching. He started noting other details. What they wore, what they carried, how they moved. The briefcases were always leather, always slim, not overstuffed with papers like salespeople usually carried, not bulky with product samples. Just thin, professional cases that could hold documents, or something else. The clothes were conservative, dark colors, well-fitted but not expensive. Nothing flashy, nothing memorable. The kind of clothes designed not to stand out. And the way they entered and exited the cab. Efficient. No wasted movement. They didn't fumble with doors, didn't struggle with seatbelts. They moved like people who'd done this many times before. Muscle memory. Frank had been trained in the Navy to notice these things. To read people, to identify threats, to stay alert, and every instinct he had was telling him that these passengers were not what they appeared to be. On a Thursday night in early April, Frank picked up a new passenger. He'd never seen this one before. Male, late 50s, silver hair, expensive watch. He gave the Grandview as pickup location and an industrial district address as destination. Frank drove. The passenger sat in back, silent as always, watching in the mirror. Halfway to the destination, Frank took a wrong turn, deliberately. Not dramatic, just one street instead of another, a route that would add 2 minutes to the trip. Most passengers would notice immediately, would say something, "Hey, where are you going?" or "This isn't the right way." This passenger said nothing. Frank continued, took another slight detour, added another minute. Still nothing. Frank corrected course. Arrived at the destination, the meter showed a fare higher than the direct route would have been. The passenger handed Frank exact change for the amount the direct route should have cost. He'd known the correct fare before they'd even started. He'd calculated it in advance. And when Frank took a longer route, he still paid only the correct amount, which meant he knew the route, he knew the distance, he knew the fare structure. He knew everything before getting in the cab. Frank's hands went cold. After the passenger left, Frank pulled over 2 blocks away, sat there, engine idling, hands shaking. This wasn't consulting. This wasn't business travel. This wasn't anything legitimate. This was surveillance, counter-surveillance, operational tradecraft. Frank had seen enough military intelligence operations in the Navy to recognize the patterns, the security protocols, the compartmentalization. These people were professionals, intelligence professionals, and they were using his cab as part of their operation. But which intelligence? American? Foreign? Corporate espionage? Something else. Frank needed to know. Not just out of curiosity, out of survival. Because if he was involved, even unknowingly, he needed to understand what he was involved in. That weekend, Frank didn't work. He called in sick, told dispatch he had the flu, stayed home. But he didn't rest. He went through his notebook page by page, every entry, every detail. He created a timeline, plotted the addresses on the city map, drew connections, looked for patterns within the pattern. And he found something. The 5 main destination addresses formed a rough circle, about 6 blocks in diameter. In the center of that circle was another building, larger, 7 stories. Frank looked it up. It was a federal office building, housing multiple agencies. Social Security, Veterans Affairs, Department of Labor, and on the 7th floor, a smaller office with no public listing. Just a suite number. Frank found a city directory from 3 years ago. The 7th floor suite was listed as State Department Liaison Office. State Department. Frank sat back. His stomach tightened. If the State Department had an office there, and if these passengers were circling around it, meeting in buildings that surrounded it, moving in patterns that suggested surveillance, then they weren't American intelligence watching foreign targets. They were foreign intelligence watching American targets. Frank's mouth went dry. He was driving foreign operatives to surveillance positions around a U.S. State Department office, and they were paying him to do it. Frank stood up, paced his apartment. His mind raced. He had to tell someone. But who? The police? They'd think he was crazy, paranoid. A taxi driver with conspiracy theories, the FBI? Did you just walk into an FBI office and report something like this? How would that work? And what if he was wrong? What if these were legitimate business travelers and he was imagining things? He'd look like an idiot, possibly lose his job. But what if he was right? What if he did nothing and something bad happened? Frank picked up his phone, put it down, picked it up again. He called information, asked for the FBI field office number, wrote it down. Then he sat there, staring at the number, not calling. 3 hours passed. Finally he called. A receptionist answered, professional, neutral. FBI, how may I direct your call? Frank hesitated. I need to report something I've noticed. I drive a taxi and... Hold, please. A click. Silence. Then another voice. Male, calm. This is Agent Morrison. How can I help you? Frank explained. He kept it simple, factual. Told him about the pattern, the passengers, the destinations, the federal building in the center. He didn't embellish, didn't speculate. Just described what he'd observed. Agent Morrison listened without interrupting. When Frank finished, there was a long pause. Then Morrison said, "What's your name?" "Frank Russo. I drive for Checker Cab Company." "Mr. Russo, I'd like to meet with you. Can you come to our office tomorrow?" "What time?" 2 p.m. Ask for me at the front desk." "Okay." "And Mr. Russo, don't discuss this with anyone else. Do you understand?" "Yes. Thank you for calling." The line went dead. Frank sat in his apartment holding the phone, feeling like he'd just stepped off a cliff. The next day, Frank went to the FBI field office. It was a nondescript building downtown. He gave his name at security, waited. Agent Morrison came down. Mid-40s, grey suit, thin, serious expression. They went to a small conference room. Morrison asked Frank to tell the story again. Frank did. Morrison took notes, asked specific questions, times, dates, descriptions, addresses. When Frank finished, Morrison closed his notebook. You did the right thing calling us, Morrison said. So it's real? I can't discuss ongoing investigations, but I can tell you that your observations are valuable. What do I do now? You continue your normal routine, you pick up passengers, you drive them where they ask. You don't do anything different. Do you understand? You want me to keep driving them? Yes. Why? Because if you stop, they'll notice, and we're not ready for them to notice. Frank felt his chest tighten. So I'm, what? Bait? You're a cooperating citizen, and we'll be watching. Watching me. Watching the situation. You'll be safe. Frank wasn't sure he believed that, but he nodded anyway. Morrison gave him a card. If anything unusual happens, call this number. Day or night, don't hesitate. Frank took the card, stood, shook Morrison's hand. Thank you for coming forward, Morrison said. A lot of people wouldn't have. Frank left the building, walked to his car, sat behind the wheel for a long time before starting the engine. He'd crossed a line. There was no going back now. That night, he returned to work. Same routine, same shift, same cab. At 10:23 p.m., he got a fare request. Pick up at the Grandview. Destination in the industrial district. Frank's heart hammered. He accepted the job, drove to the hotel, pulled up to the entrance. The passenger was waiting. The woman with the severe expression, she got in without a word. Frank drove. His hands were steady, but his palms were sweating. He kept checking the mirrors, looking for surveillance, looking for FBI agents, looking for anything unusual. He saw nothing, just normal traffic, normal night. He arrived at the destination. The woman paid exact change, got out, walked towards the building. Frank watched her disappear inside. Then he pulled away, circled the block, parked in a different location, waited. Nothing happened. No FBI agents appeared. No arrests. Nothing. Frank drove away, picked up another fare, a couple leaving a restaurant, then a college student going home from the library. Normal passengers, normal conversations, but the whole night he felt like he was being watched, like every shadow held someone, like every car behind him was following. He was part of it now, really part of it, not just an unwitting participant. A cooperating witness, an asset, and assets could be exposed, assets could be compromised, assets could disappear. Exposure and consequences for 2 weeks, nothing changed. Frank continued driving the pattern passengers. They continued their silent routines. Frank reported each trip to Agent Morrison, brief phone calls. Just the facts. Morrison thanked him and hung up. Frank didn't know what the FBI was doing with the information. Morrison wouldn't tell him. Ongoing investigation, he'd say. Can't discuss details. But Frank could feel the tension building. Something was coming. Some kind of resolution. He didn't know what. Didn't know when. Just knew it was inevitable. On a Tuesday night, 3 weeks after Frank's first meeting with Morrison, everything changed. Frank picked up a passenger at the Grandview. Male, early 40s, dark hair, glasses, one of the regulars. Frank had driven him 4 times before. The destination was the usual address, industrial district, 6-block radius around the federal building. Frank drove. The passenger sat in back, watching, silent. Halfway there, Frank's phone rang. The special phone Morrison had given him. A simple flip phone, one number programmed in. Frank answered, keeping one hand on the wheel. Yeah? It's Morrison. Where are you? On a fare. The industrial district. Passenger with you? Yes. Listen carefully. When you drop him off, drive away normally. Don't deviate from your routine. We're moving tonight. Frank's heart jumped. Moving? Just do what I said. Drop him off. Drive away. Go to the safe location we discussed. Wait there. The line went dead. Frank's hands tightened on the wheel. The passenger in back was watching him in the mirror. Everything okay? The passenger asked. First time he'd initiated conversation. Yeah. Sorry. Dispatch. Of course. Frank drove the rest of the way in silence. Arrived at the destination. The passenger paid exact change. Got out. Frank watched him walk toward the building. The man didn't look back, didn't hesitate, just walked inside like every other time. Frank pulled away, drove 3 blocks, turned onto a side street, parked. His phone rang again. Morrison, you clear? Yes. Stay where you are. Keep your eyes open. If anyone approaches your vehicle, drive away immediately. Call me. What's happening? We're executing arrests. Multiple locations. It's going to be loud. Stay away from the industrial district. For how long? At least 2 hours? Possibly longer. And then you go home. Resume normal life. We'll be in touch." Morrison hung up. Frank sat in his cab, engine running, watching the street. It was nearly midnight. Light traffic, a few pedestrians. Nothing unusual. Then he heard sirens. Distant at first. Then closer. Multiple sirens. Police. Federal agents. Frank turned on his radio, scanned the channels. Police bands were encrypted, but he could hear the traffic on the commercial channels. Major operation underway in the industrial district. Federal agents. Multiple buildings. Frank sat there listening. His heart hammered. His mouth was dry. This was real. This was actually happening. And he'd helped make it happen. After 2 hours, Morrison called again. "You can go home now. Don't discuss this with anyone. We'll contact you tomorrow." Frank drove home. The streets were empty. The industrial district was lit up with flashing lights, police barricades, news vans. He parked, went upstairs, turned on the television. Breaking news. Federal raid. Espionage investigation. Multiple arrests. Soviet intelligence network operating in the city. Years-long operation. Compromised classified information. Frank sat on his couch, watching the coverage, feeling numb. Soviet intelligence. He'd been driving Soviet operatives for weeks, maybe months before he'd even noticed the pattern. The news showed footage of people being led out of buildings in handcuffs. Frank recognized some of them. The woman with the severe expression, the tall man in dark suits, the nervous younger man, his passengers, his fares, spies. If you made it this far, type exact change in the comments so I know you're still here with me. The next day, Agent Morrison came to Frank's apartment, brought another agent. They asked Frank to walk through everything again. Every detail, every observation. Frank told them, showed them his notebook, his charts, his timeline. Morrison nodded. "Your observations were critical. You helped us identify movement patterns we'd been missing. The timing, the coordination, you filled in significant gaps. What happens now? Now we process the arrests, build the cases. Most of it will be classified. The public won't know the full extent. Will they know about me? No. Your involvement will remain confidential for your safety." "Am I in danger?" Morrison exchanged a glance with the other agent. "We don't believe so. The network has been dismantled, but we'll maintain periodic contact. Check in. Make sure everything's stable." "For how long?" "Indefinitely." Frank nodded slowly. "So I just go back to driving a cab?" "Yes, that's exactly what you do." And that's what Frank did. He returned to work the next week. Same shifts, same routes, same cab with the dent and the cracked windshield, but everything felt different. Every passenger made him wonder. Every destination made him watch. Every quiet trip made him remember the pattern. The Grandview stopped generating the unusual fares. No more silent passengers paying exact change. No more trips to the industrial district at precise intervals. It was over. The machine had been dismantled. The operation shut down. Frank kept driving for another 8 years. He saw the Cold War end on television. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union collapsed. The world changed. But Frank never forgot those weeks in 1981 when he had been part of something larger than himself, when his ordinary routine had intersected with invisible wars and hidden operations. He never told anyone, not his friends, not the woman he dated for a few years in the mid-80s, not even his brother who he was close with. He kept the secret, locked it away, filed it under things that happened that no one would believe anyway. Agent Morrison called once a year, brief check-ins. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, everything's fine." "Good. Stay safe." "You too?" After the Soviet Union fell, the calls stopped. Morrison retired, Frank assumed. Or maybe the file was just closed. Case concluded. No further monitoring required. Frank retired from driving in 1989, sold his lease back to the company, got a job at the hardware store downstairs from his apartment, fixing keys, mixing paint, helping customers find the right screws. Quieter work. Easier on the back, no more night shifts. But sometimes on slow afternoons, Frank would stand behind the counter and think about those passengers. The silent watchers, the exact change payers, the operatives moving through the city like ghosts, using his cab as camouflage and he'd think about the thin line between ordinary life and extraordinary events, how they intersect without warning, how you can drive the same streets for years and never realize what's happening in the buildings you pass, the information moving, the operations running, the invisible wars being fought. He'd been a small part of it, a taxi driver who noticed something and said something. Nothing heroic, nothing dramatic, just a man who paid attention and trusted his instincts. But in the end, that's how most wars are won, not by grand gestures, not by obvious heroes, but by ordinary people in ordinary jobs who notice when something doesn't fit the pattern, who see the small details that don't add up, who ask the quiet questions, who make the uncomfortable phone call. Frank Russo was one of those people, a Navy veteran turned taxi driver who helped dismantle a Soviet intelligence network operating in his city. His name never appeared in any newspaper. His contribution was never publicly acknowledged. The classified files remain sealed. But he knows. And somewhere, in a filing cabinet in a federal building, there's a record of what he did. A record of the night shift driver who paid attention, who kept a notebook, who called the FBI, who helped protect his country in a way he never expected. That's the real story of the Cold War. Not just missiles and diplomats, but taxi drivers and nurses and clerks and teachers, ordinary people who noticed when something was wrong and chose to act. Frank Russo was one of them, and his contribution, though invisible, mattered. And so ends our story. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. In the comments, leave creative suggestions so we can continue to improve the quality of our content. Comment on where you're from. Check out the stories and the video on screen. See you in a few seconds. My name is Victor Hale, and this is my contribution.